The silence of Christmas. Snow fell in a steady hush, blanketing the world beyond the cabin in a quiet that felt almost deliberate, as though the night itself had chosen to forget her. Inside, the fire crackled softly, its amber glow flickering across the wooden walls, casting long, restless shadows that seemed to breathe with the wind outside. Elena Whitmore sat alone before it, her hands wrapped around a porcelain mug that had long since gone cold. Across the room, a small Christmas tree stood decorated but lifeless, its ornaments catching light without warmth. Beneath it lay a single wrapped gift, neatly tied, untouched, and already losing meaning with every passing hour. Elena's eyes lingered on it longer than necessary, as if willing it to matter again. This wasn't the first Christmas she had spent like this. She exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the fire, and leaned back in her chair. The silence was familiar now. It pressed gently rather than sharply, settling into her bones like the winter cold outside. Once she had feared it. Now, she simply endured it. Her gaze drifted toward the clock above the mantel. Nearly 9. He wasn't coming. The thought didn't sting the way it used to. It arrived instead with a dull certainty, like a truth she had rehearsed too many times. Still, her fingers tightened slightly around the mug, betraying something she refused to name. As if summoned by her thoughts, her phone buzzed against the wooden table beside her. The sound was sudden, jarring in the stillness. Elena hesitated before reaching for it, her heartbeat quickening despite herself. "Daniel." She answered on the second ring. "Hey." His voice came through, distant and distracted, layered with the faint hum of activity behind him. "Merry Christmas." Elena swallowed. "Merry Christmas." There was a pause, not the comfortable kind, but the hollow one that stretched too thin between people who no longer knew what to say. "I won't make it tonight," Daniel continued, as if reading from a script he had used before. "Flights are delayed, and things here, they're just a mess." "Of course they are," Elena thought, though she said nothing. "I figured," she replied quietly. Another pause, longer this time. "You understand, right?" he added, almost as an afterthought. Elena glanced at the empty chair across from her, the one she had set hours ago out of habit more than hope. "I always do." He didn't catch the weight in her words. Or perhaps he chose not to. "I'll make it up to you," he said quickly. "When things settle down." She almost smiled at that. "Almost." "Sure," she murmured. A few more words were exchanged, surface level, obligatory, and then the call ended as abruptly as it had begun. The silence returned, heavier now, settling into the spaces his voice had briefly disturbed. Elena lowered the phone slowly, her reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. For a moment, she studied it, searching for something she couldn't quite define. Then she set it aside and turned back to the fire. Once, Daniel had sat beside her here, his laughter filling the room, his presence enough to make even the harshest winters feel distant. Once, this cabin had been their escape, a place where time slowed and everything unnecessary fell away. But that had been before his work became everything, before late nights turned into missed calls and missed calls turned into absence, before she learned how to measure love in excuses. She rose from her chair, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she crossed the room. The floor creaked softly beneath her steps, a quiet reminder that at least something still acknowledged her presence. In the small kitchen, she moved through the motions of preparing dinner, simple, efficient, devoid of ceremony. One plate, one glass, one set of utensils. She carried it back to the table and sat down, the chair opposite her remaining untouched, as it had all evening. For a while, she ate in silence, the fire her only companion. But even its warmth felt distant now, unable to reach the quiet ache settling deeper within her chest. Halfway through the meal, she paused, her fork hovering midair as a thought surfaced uninvited. When she stopped expecting more. The question lingered, unanswered. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a fresh wave of snow against the glass. Elena turned her head toward the sound, her brow furrowing slightly. The storm was worsening. For a moment, She simply listened to the wind, the fire, her own breathing, each one blending into a rhythm that felt both steady and fragile. Then, faintly beneath it all, something else. A sound. She froze. It came again, soft, uncertain, but unmistakable. A knock. Elena's heart skipped, her body going still as her eyes shifted slowly toward the door. No one ever came this far out. Not in weather like this. Not at this hour. The knock sounded again, slightly louder this time, carrying a quiet urgency that cut through the storm. Elena stood, her chair scraping faintly against the floor. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze fixed on the door as doubt crept in. Then, almost without thinking, she stepped forward. Each movement felt deliberate, the distance between her and the door stretching longer than it should. The firelight flickered behind her, casting her shadow ahead, toward whatever waited on the other side. She reached the handle and paused, her fingers hovering just above it. Another knock. Closer now. Weaker. Elena drew in a slow breath. And then, finally, she opened the door. The knock in the storm. The door creaked open against the weight of the wind, and the cold rushed in like something alive, sharp, immediate, and unforgiving. Snow swirled through the narrow gap, carried by a restless gust that extinguished the fragile warmth lingering at the threshold. For a brief second, Elena saw nothing but white. Then he stepped forward. A man emerged from the storm, tall and broad-shouldered, his figure half obscured by the falling snow. His coat was heavy but worn, dusted in frost, and his dark hair clung damply to his temples. His face, pale from the cold, held a quiet tension, not fear, but restraint, as if he had already considered turning away before knocking. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, steady despite the cold. "I didn't know where else to go." Elena didn't respond immediately. Her hand remained on the door, her body caught between instinct and caution. Up close, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the faint tremor in his shoulders that betrayed how long he had been out there. "You're far from the main road," she said finally, her voice measured. "I know." A faint breath escaped him, visible in the air. "My car broke down a few miles back. I tried to walk it, but..." He glanced briefly over his shoulder at the storm, then back at her. "I wouldn't have knocked if it wasn't necessary." There was no urgency in his tone, only quiet honesty. It unsettled her more than desperation would have. Elena hesitated, her grip tightening slightly on the door. Every instinct urged caution. She was alone, miles from anyone, with a stranger standing in front of her. And yet, the cold bit deeper as the wind surged again, forcing its way inside. The man didn't step forward. He didn't plead. He simply waited, as if he had already accepted whatever decision she would make. Something in that stillness shifted her. "You'd better come in," she said, stepping aside before she could reconsider. Relief flickered across his face, subtle, restrained. "Thank you." He entered carefully, as though mindful not to disrupt the fragile order of the space. Snow fell from his coat in soft clumps onto the wooden floor, melting almost instantly in the warmth. Elena closed the door quickly, shutting out the storm with a firm push. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The contrast was immediate, the harsh cold replaced by the steady heat of the fire, the howling wind reduced to a distant murmur beyond the walls. The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just enough to reveal how tense they had been. "You can leave your coat there," Elena said, gesturing toward a wooden hook by the door. He nodded and complied, his movements deliberate. Beneath the coat, his clothing was simple, practical, damp from the snow. Not a traveler unprepared, but not someone who had planned to be stranded either. "I appreciate this," he said, turning back to her. "More than you know." Elena inclined her head slightly, unsure how to respond. Gratitude felt like too much for what she had done, and yet not enough for what it might become. "Sit," she said after a moment, motioning toward the chair near the fire. "You need to warm up." He obeyed without argument, lowering himself into the chair with a quiet exhale. The firelight caught the angles of his face, softening the severity of his features, revealing something calmer beneath the strain. Elena moved toward the kitchen without another word, filling a kettle and setting it over the flame. The familiar routine steadied her, giving her hands something to do, something to focus on other than the presence now filling the room. "You live out here alone?" he asked after a moment, his voice careful, not intrusive. The question lingered in the space between them. "For now," Elena replied, her back still turned as she watched the water begin to heat. He didn't press further. Instead, he nodded slightly, as though the answer had confirmed something he already suspected. "I'm Lucas," he said. She hesitated, then turned just enough to meet his gaze. "Elena." The name settled between them, simple yet grounding, transforming the interaction from chance to something more defined. By the time she returned with 2 cups of tea, the tension in the room had shifted. It hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, reshaped into something quieter, more deliberate. She handed him a cup, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it lingered. "Thank you," Lucas said again, his voice lower now, steadier as the warmth began to reach him. Elena sat across from him, her own cup cradled between her hands. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence with a rhythm that felt almost intentional. It was Lucas who broke it. "Bad night to be alone," he said, his gaze fixed on the flames. Elena followed his line of sight, watching the fire shift and settle. "You get used to it." He glanced at her then, something unreadable passing through his expression. "That doesn't mean you should." The words were simple, unadorned, but they landed with unexpected weight. Elena looked away first, her grip tightening slightly around the cup. "It's just one night." Lucas didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was softer, almost thoughtful. "It never is." Silence followed again, but this time it felt different. Not empty. Aware. Outside, the storm raged on, pressing against the walls, isolating them further from the world beyond. Inside, the fire burned steadily, its warmth no longer confined to the room alone. Elena shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze drifting back to Lucas. He was no longer just a stranger at her door, and something about that realization unsettled her more than the storm ever could. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. The line that shouldn't be crossed. The storm deepened as the night wore on, its relentless voice pressing against the cabin walls like a warning neither of them acknowledged. Inside, the fire had grown steadier, its glow softening the edges of everything it touched. Shadows shifted lazily across the room, no longer restless but intimate, as if the space itself had begun to exhale. Elena remained seated across from Lucas, her posture composed, but no longer guarded. Tom had slipped into something quieter, less measured. The distance between them, once defined by caution, had narrowed in ways she could not quite explain. "You should get some rest," she said eventually, though her voice lacked insistence. Lucas shook his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I've had worse nights." There was no bravado in the statement, only a quiet truth that seemed to carry more than it revealed. Elena studied him for a moment, noting the way he held himself, not tense, not relaxed, but balanced, as though he had learned long ago how to exist comfortably within uncertainty. "You travel a lot?" she asked. "Enough," he replied. "That's not an answer." A faint smile touched his lips, subtle but real. "It's the only one that matters." She almost pressed further, but something in his tone suggested boundaries he preferred to keep. Instead, she let the conversation shift naturally, as it had all evening. "Do you always knock on strangers' doors?" she asked. "Only when I have no other choice." "And tonight?" Lucas glanced at her, his expression steady. "Tonight, I'm glad I did." The words lingered longer than they should have. Elena looked away, her attention returning to the fire as something within her tightened, an awareness she hadn't invited but couldn't ignore. It had been years since anyone had spoken to her with that kind of presence, that quiet certainty that made words feel deliberate rather than habitual. The realization unsettled her. She rose from her chair, breaking the moment before it could take shape. "I'll get you a blanket," she said, her voice measured. Lucas didn't stop her. In the small hallway, Elena paused briefly, her hand resting against the wall as she steadied herself. The air felt different here, cooler, clearer, yet it did little to quiet the unease building beneath her calm exterior. This was a mistake, not letting him in. That had been instinct, human, necessary. But this quiet unfolding, this ease that had settled too quickly between them, it carried a weight she wasn't prepared to confront. She retrieved a blanket from the closet and returned to the main room, her movements deliberate. Lucas looked up as she approached. "You can take the chair," she said, placing the blanket over the backrest. "It's close enough to the fire." He nodded. "And you?" "I'll be fine." The response came too quickly, too practiced. Lucas studied her for a moment, then spoke with quiet clarity. "You don't have to pretend you're used to it." Elena stilled. "I'm not pretending," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "No," he said gently. "You've just convinced yourself it's easier." The words struck deeper than she expected. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze fixed somewhere just beyond him. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence that followed, but it did nothing to soften the truth settling between them. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally. "Not everything," Lucas agreed. "But I know what it looks like when someone's been alone for too long." Elena's breath caught, subtle but undeniable. She turned away, taking a step toward the window, as if distance might restore the balance she had begun to lose. Outside, the storm raged on, the darkness thick and impenetrable. There was no path forward, no direction. Only the certainty that neither of them was leaving anytime soon. Behind her, Lucas remained still. "You can tell me to leave," he said quietly. "I won't argue." Elena closed her eyes briefly. That was the moment, the one that mattered. The line, clear and undeniable, drawn not by circumstance but by choice. She could step back, reclaim the distance, restore the quiet, familiar emptiness that had defined her nights. She should. Instead, she turned. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier certainty. Lucas held her gaze, something shifting in his expression. Not surprise, not triumph, but recognition. Of what? She wasn't sure. The space between them felt smaller now, though neither of them had moved. The firelight flickered, casting a warmth that seemed to settle not just around them, but within them. Elena took a step closer, her movements slow, deliberate, as though each one carried its own question. Lucas didn't retreat, didn't advance. He simply remained. Her hand brushed against the edge of the chair beside him, steadying herself as the weight of the moment pressed in. She could feel it now, the pull she had tried to ignore, the quiet, undeniable shift that had taken place somewhere between the first knock and now. "This isn't right," she said, though the words felt distant, disconnected from the reality unfolding before her. Lucas's voice was calm. "No." She met his eyes again, searching for resistance, for something that might anchor her back to what she knew. She found none, only understanding. And that was worse. Her hand moved before she could stop it, resting lightly against his, barely there, a contact so small it could have been dismissed as accidental. But it wasn't. Neither of them moved. The fire crackled. The storm howled. And in that suspended moment, everything that had been unspoken found its shape. Elena's breath faltered, her gaze dropping briefly to where their hands met, then lifting again to his. There was still time to pull away, still time to choose differently. But she didn't. Instead, she let the silence answer for her. And as the distance between them disappeared, Elena understood with quiet certainty. Some lines aren't crossed all at once. They're stepped over slowly, until there's no way back. The morning after truth. Morning arrived without ceremony. The storm had passed some time before dawn, leaving behind a silence far deeper than the one it had interrupted. Pale winter light filtered through the frost-lined windows, washing the cabin in a muted stillness that felt almost unfamiliar after the intensity of the night. Elena woke slowly, her awareness returning in fragments rather than all at once. The fire had burned low, its embers faint but persistent, casting a soft glow that barely reached the corners of the room. For a moment, she remained still, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as memory settled into place. Then she turned her head. Lucas was awake. He sat near the window, his posture composed, his attention fixed on the snow-covered landscape outside. The light traced the outline of his profile, sharpening the quiet distance that had replaced the closeness of the night before. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence was different now. Not uncertain, not searching, but weighted with recognition. Whatever had existed between them in the warmth of the firelight had not disappeared, but it had changed, reshaped by the clarity that morning inevitably brought. "You're leaving," Elena said, her voice softer than she intended. It wasn't a question. Lucas didn't turn right away. "The roads will clear soon." A simple answer. Practical. Expected. Elena pushed herself upright, drawing the blanket closer around her shoulders. The space between them felt larger now, though neither had moved far. It wasn't physical distance that had shifted. It was something quieter, more final. "You don't have to go yet," she said, though the words lacked conviction. Lucas turned then, meeting her gaze with a calm steadiness that made it difficult to look away. "I do." There was no hesitation in his tone, no ambiguity. Elena held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something, regret, perhaps, or reluctance. But what she found instead was something far more unsettling. Clarity. He wasn't leaving because he wanted to. He was leaving because he understood. She looked down, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the blanket. The truth of that settled heavily within her, not as accusation, but as quiet acknowledgement. Last night had been real, but it wasn't meant to last. Lucas rose from his chair, his movements unhurried as he reached for his coat. The fabric had dried overnight, though faint traces of the storm still clung to its surface. He paused briefly, as if considering something, then turned back toward her. Elena. Her name, spoken simply, carried more weight than anything else he could have said. She looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words felt insufficient now, too rigid for something that had existed in silence as much as in speech. "You should have more than this," Lucas said finally. Elena frowned slightly. "More than what?" He gestured subtly around the room, not dismissively, but with quiet intention. "Waiting, excusing, settling." The words landed without force, yet they settled deeper than any accusation could have. Elena exhaled slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the world stretched wide and untouched, the snow reflecting the morning light with a clarity that felt almost unforgiving. "It's not that simple," she said. "I didn't say it was." She glanced back at him. "Then what are you saying?" Lucas held her gaze, his expression steady. "That last night wasn't about me." The truth of it was immediate. Elena felt it before she could question it. He wasn't wrong. What had happened between them hadn't begun with him knocking on her door. It had begun long before that, with missed calls, empty chairs, quiet dinners, and the slow erosion of something that had once felt certain. Lucas had only stepped into a space that had already been hollow. "You think I don't know that?" she asked quietly. "I think you do," he replied. "I just don't think you've decided what to do about it." Elena didn't respond, because there was nothing to say. Lucas nodded slightly, as if her silence had confirmed something. Then, without further hesitation, he slipped his coat on and moved toward the door. The finality of the motion stirred something sharp within her chest. "Lucas!" He paused, his hand resting lightly on the handle. Elena stood, the blanket falling loosely around her shoulders as she took a step forward. The words she wanted to say felt just out of reach, too complicated, too undefined to take shape. So she chose the only truth she could manage. Last night mattered. Lucas didn't turn fully, but she saw the faint shift in his expression. "I know," he said. It was enough. No promises. No expectations. Just acknowledgement. He opened the door, and the cold air slipped inside once more. Less violent now, but no less real. The world beyond waited, quiet and unchanged, as if nothing within these walls had ever happened. Lucas stepped out into the snow, his figure steady against the pale landscape. Elena remained where she was, her gaze fixed on him as he moved farther away, each step carrying him beyond the fragile boundary of the night they had shared. He didn't look back, and somehow she understood why. The door closed with a soft, final sound. The cabin fell silent again, but it wasn't the same silence. Elena stood there for a long moment, her thoughts settling slowly into something clearer, sharper. The weight of the night remained, but it no longer pressed down on her. It steadied her instead, forcing her to see what she had spent too long avoiding. Her phone buzzed suddenly on the table. She turned, her steps measured as she reached for it. Daniel. The name stared back at her, familiar and distant all at once. For a moment, she simply looked at it, her reflection faintly visible in the screen. Then she answered. Hey. His voice came through unchanged. I think I can make it tomorrow instead. Things finally cleared up. Elena listened, her expression calm, her posture steady. For the first time, she heard him clearly, not just his words, but the space behind them, the absence, the habit. And for the first time, she didn't fill it for him. I see, she said quietly. There was a pause, as though he expected more. She didn't offer it. Outside, the snow continued to fall lightly, the world moving forward without hesitation. Inside, Elena stood by the fire, no longer waiting for warmth that never came. The line had been crossed, but what lay ahead was finally hers to choose.